Hey everyone, welcome back to the Minor Struggle Podcast. I'm your host, Laura Ferry. Today's episode is a really important one. I'm sitting down with Tami Lysher, the owner of a Pilates studio who has devoted her work and studies to trauma-informed recovery. Tami's approach goes far beyond movement for fitness. It's about understanding how trauma lives in the body, how cycles get passed down, and how we can begin to interrupt them through safe, intentional movement. She's the creator of Move into Calm, her signature program that focuses on regulation, reconnection, and learning how to feel safe in your own body again. This conversation is for anyone who has tried to think their way through healing and realized the body has its own story to tell. I'm really grateful for this one. So when you're ready, grab a cup of coffee and come get uncomfortable with me. Hey, Tami, thank you for joining us. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what it is that you do?
Sure. My job is kind of twofold. I own a Pilates studio. I'm located in Michigan. And so I work with adults and I also work with children, but I've created a program, the one that we're going to talk about, and it's called Move into Calm. And it can be used for either adults or for children, but it's through the nervous system lens and a trauma-informed lens that help parents to understand why the nervous system is a big part of the regulation for children, especially when they're having behavioral issues. And we can talk more about that in just a minute. Um, so, and I've done things within the field of early childhood and connecting movement. And when I say movement, I'm talking yoga, Pilates with my education. So I actually have a master's degree in early childhood education. And so it brings it all together with Move into Calm. So
That's beautiful. So
thank
what led you down this path? I'm sure there's many layers obviously involved
you.
considering your education and then what this has turned into.
Yeah. I actually am an adult childhood trauma survivor. My father was an alcoholic. And it was, it was always one of those things that, like, when I grew up, it was never really ever talked about, and things were just kind of shoved under the rug. And, when you start beginning to look at trauma, and so oftentimes people want to just like mum's the word on trauma. And for me, the door, especially with trauma with children, really began to open probably, I'm just going to say, in the early 2000s, maybe even 90, like in the late 90s.
Hmm.
And I was working in a childcare center that had multiple mothers and children, and I saw them and they were living in poverty. And so oftentimes the kids' behaviors would mimic like the mothers. And so there's all kinds of studies that have been done. One of them specifically is called the ACEs study, and it's an adverse early childhood screening tool. And there's criteria on there, and poverty is one of the biggest factors that can show up in children and how it affects their learning, how it affects their mobility. When I say mobility, I'm talking about their gross motor skills.
Hmm.
And I always felt like there was something, with myself where I was always, from a young age, I was a people pleaser. I had difficulty making decisions. I married another alcoholic and I always wanted to, I was going to say, oh, it's going to change. My daughters are going to grow up differently and blah, blah, blah. And I was much more aware of how their interaction was. And as time went on, unfortunately, I ended up divorcing him. And I believe that because I've gone pretty deep in my own healing, that's made a really big impact on my daughters. And I have 3 grandchildren. And so it's also made a difference in them as well.
And how fortunate you are to kind of break that generational cycle, from repeating itself.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So
And
go ahead.
I was just going to say I recently, like, I guess, okay, so today's Friday. So I would have listened to a new podcast and it was I just want to reach. It was Mel Robbins and she
Right.
interviewed Dr. Marielle Broquette. There's the book. And it's called Break the Cycle. And it was just so empowering to me to still continue to do the work that I'm doing.
Hmm.
It was just, it's intergenerational trauma and people don't think about it that much. And it's all around us. When you grow up and you see firsthand, and I guess for me, I've done the trauma work now since probably 20 years I've worked in the trauma issue in the trauma areas. So, but intergenerational trauma is something that it's beginning to be much more talked about.
Hmm.
And I know you know that too as well. And then when you look at communities where there's been a lot of trauma, like I worked in it's called Flint, Michigan. And so about probably 10 or 15 years ago, there was a water crisis. And so there was no clean drinking water and it impacted so many families. Even though I worked in it, it never really truly, it didn't impact me because I didn't live in the community. Like I would take bottled water to work where I didn't have to bathe in it and I didn't have to do all these other things. And so I really began to like really, really focus in on like just basic needs, like going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and looking at all of those kind of things. It was really, I think it's been multiple layers of like like what does poverty and what does trauma really look like for children and families?
That's really interesting. So, how did Pilates specifically, because you've mentioned that before, tie into this trauma healing for you? What is that bridge? Like, what does it look like?
That bridge for me was yoga was first, and then it was Pilates. And it was through Pilates that I found tools that could open my body up. So when Dr. Bessel van der Kolk talks about the body keeps score, that for me was really resonated. And it was through like working with my feet because I'd had a lot of trauma to my feet as a child. And it wasn't intentional by my parents, but I grew up and I wore braces on my feet. I had special shoes that like really inhibited, like they kept my feet all crunched up. And so there was a lot of things with my own feet that Pilates began to open that up. And I know that may sound funny, but there's something called footwork that it was actually something was really the connection to beginning to open my body up through my feet upward.
Hmm.
And even through like exercises. I teach mat Pilates, but I'm comprehensively trained and just understanding like when you breathe and how your ribs expand and breath work. And it was very profound for me. And the first thing that I really connected with was I wrote a curriculum called Trauma Informed Movement, and it was actually for the adults. And
Hmm.
one of like, or no, I did one for children and then I did one for adults. When you write online curriculum, you have to, it's kind of like you do this because you're constantly seeking people. And I did that for, I don't know, probably a few years. I worked with specifically with Pilates instructors, yoga instructors, and talking about the impacts of trauma, how it impacts our health, how it impacts so much. And when you're working with people, on that kind of a level, and I see firsthand in all of my clients right now that I still work with, that most people that come to me have been impacted by some kind of trauma, either their adult life or child, or they're bringing their children to me to help them because it impacts our breathing, impacts our immune system, it impacts our brain, it
Hmm.
impacts so much. But for me personally, the door began to unlock through my feet. And then later it was really, and this has been probably 6 years or so, I started practicing the nervous system work and understanding how the nervous system, like if you've been exposed to trauma as a child and you've not dealt with it, sometimes our nervous system stays in that fight, flight, or freeze. And so for me, I was always in that flight and I was always overachieving and I was always doing more than my fair share or
Hmm.
volunteer for things at work and taking on bigger loads of work. So it was really because I was working full time and I owned the studio. So, and I worked a lot of hours. I worked a lot of hours. Laura, did that answer your question how Pilates segued in or did I kind of go around?
Yeah, it did. I'm curious about like so the braces on your feet. So it's interesting because it was obviously probably addressing an issue that you had at the
It
time,
was,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So
So,
I was born flat footed and I started wearing hard soled shoes. And if you think about, like, I'm going to use my hand. If you think about a hard-soled shoe, you don't have that bending and that flexing with it.
Right, right.
And the shoe came up around my ankle. So, for example, when a child developmentally learns to run, to jump, to even balance on their toes or any of those kind of skills, my foot was restricted in the shoe. So running was a really, I didn't learn how to run correctly. And so I would always end up with shin splints. And it wasn't until much later, like with Pilates, that I realized how restrictive my feet really were. And I have worked very hard at getting my feet to be opened up, like where I balance on my toes. And we don't realize how much it impacts our balance. So I can't tell you how many sprained ankles I had, how I've injured, like from falling. I've injured my knee, specifically my left knee. And I mean, I don't have any joint replacements, but I've also worked really, really hard at strengthening my body and my feet.
Right. So it's just kind of interesting how we wind up where we are. So when you tried Pilates or yoga for the first time that you were like that
It
it
was
had this epiphany and it was
It
yeah.
was it was it was yo it was yoga was really good for me because it calmed my body down, and was the meditation. And then I tried Pilates, and I went to a studio that had all of the equipment, and when I got on the equipment is where I really realized that I could bring my heels down, because I could never bring, like, my Achilles tendon would never allow me to bring my whole foot down to the floor. Like, if I would
Okay.
squat, I would be on my toes. And that's not saying that that's not everybody, but it's the range of motion in the foot, and that's just how my body was built. But I met with actually, she was another Pilates teacher, and she sat down on the floor with me, she held my ankles, and she said, "Now squat." And my heels for the first time went all the way down to the floor with her support. And I still follow her, I still work with her. Because she was like, it was really like this really big eye opener for me, that what Pilates can do.
So how old were you when you made this discovery?
Oh gosh, I was an adult. We're talking, I've practiced now Pilates since the mid-90s, mat Pilates, but it wasn't until probably the early 2000s where I really began to make deeper connections to my feet and what because they held me back. I didn't run because it hurt. Didn't, I, I couldn't play basketball because I wasn't able, like, my foot never learned those basic movements as a child. And so I had to
Mhm.
reteach myself. So it was rewiring, kind of like we rewire our brain. I rewired
Mhm.
my feet, and I did it. And you can't see what I've got behind me, but no, I'm not gonna. But anyways, just even practicing balance, like even today, I still practice balance, and I challenge myself with different kinds of balance, because living here, you can go outside and it can be icy, especially in the wintertime and
Mhm.
fall. I just want to take, like, just precaution.
Right.
So, and I see, it's interesting because you know, we don't realize that trauma can impact our body on so many different levels. And when I did a dissertation for a master's degree in 2005, wrote the impacts of poverty, but I focused it on motor development for young children, because what I saw were two things: was their motor skills were delayed, both fine motor and gross motor, but also many of them had speech delays, which we don't think about speech as being a fine motor skill, but it truly is because of the articulation with the tongue.
Mhm.
So, and that was really like, so now we're in 2025. Yeah, 2025. So it's been like the last 20 years that I've really, like, between working with the kids, but even now seeing and working privately with children, they're still having motor delays, and that those motor delays can impact their ability to learn in school. Because if you don't have a strong core, how can you sit and hold a pencil of that? Hold a pencil at a table without collapsing it,
Right.
or sitting at group time on the floor. And I'm talking, these are young children, and I'm talking like, like under age like 10.
So what is the this breaking the cycle and the trauma work, like, what does that look like in regards to right now what you do with the programs that you offer? Can you give me some examples of, like, how
Yeah.
you start this?
So usually the parents, excuse me, I have a 21-day course and I talk about the nervous system. And I think that sometimes having a better understanding of how the nervous system impacts our body, which leads to more education around trauma. So I don't you usually when I meet people, I don't usually start with trauma. It's usually I start with, what's going on in the child's body or what's going on in the adult's body. And then eventually talking about, you know, things with, if we've had a surgery or we've had a significant injury, that can be a trauma to our body, just like my feet, even though it
Mhm.
wasn't necessarily, keeping my feet cooped up in shoes was a trauma to my feet.
Right,
So
right.
to go back to your question, I think that starting where the parents are and the child is at, like where they are, I can't push someone forward if they're not ready to hear about trauma. So I start
Mhm.
usually with what are you, what's going on with the child? And a lot of times I'm working with kids that have sensory issues or IEPs. Do you know what that is?
Mhm. Yep. You can tell everybody though if they don't know.
So an IEP is an individualized education plan, and we have them all across the United States. And, they usually will be diagnosed either like the ones that I've worked with. And for whatever reason, predominantly it has been boys.
Mhm.
They've had a variety of things where they've had um, ADHD. I've had some that have had speech and language issues, even at age 8 or 10. Motor delays, coordination, articulation, like putting things to get small things together with their hands. So I'm not a occupational therapist. I'm not a physical therapist. I'm coming from it from an education background. So giving
Mhm.
these kids the tools, like they get to school, if they get anxious, they always have their breath. And so teaching the kids
Right.
about breath.
So is that something that you're using right now in your practice is breath work that goes along right along with
Breath
everything?
work, yes, breath work, movement, and when I say movement, it can be yoga, Pilates, it might be balance,
Mhm.
it might be throwing a ball because if they're not coordinated, like just even beginning to throw a ball and then maybe having them throw a ball and maybe then stand on one foot or hopping or using, I have lots of different props that I use for balance with the kids because I keep it fun. When I say lots, Laura, I can't even begin to tell you all of the materials I use. Bubbles. I use something called a stretchy. It is like it's a made out of lycra, and it can go over their head all the way to their feet. And when children put the stretchy band on, it feels like a big stretchy hug. But what it does to their nervous system is it makes them feel calm.
Mhm. That makes
So
sense actually, because right when someone's having some sort of, I don't want to say panic attack because that might not be the right technical term for it, but the pressure really, really helps, right? Like pressure being held. Yeah. And that's why they make those weighted blankets too. That helps the nervous.
yeah. And I think that, when you think about those kinds of things, or for even kids in school, they're called weighted vests, and they've had other things that, or maybe even just a partial, like a weighted blanket or something that can come over their shoulders.
Mhm.
And I think that, but sometimes they don't like that heavier, like the weightedness of the blanket because sometimes it can feel really heavy. Where is the stretchies is lycra, so it's really stretchy. I wish I would have brought one up.
So
I'm
you feel
sorry.
the pressure, but without the weight, essentially.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
That makes
Yes.
a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I use it a lot with I use it with probably I don't necessarily always start off with the stretchies. I also use a vibration plate with the kids and they really like that. And I would say if people are listening, if you try even having them sit, I'm talking little, like
Mhm.
3 minutes max to start with. And it always makes a difference. So, and it's something quick and easy. So but movement is always a part of what I do. So it's movement and breath, and then giving the parents tools to take home. The parents work with me, and if anybody follows me on Instagram or Facebook, I do a lot. Like I show a lot of things on my feeds that are beneficial for parents. I have a YouTube channel and I'm just beginning to really pull more things into it because the name of the program is called Move into Calm. But I think
Okay.
too, um, Laura, so the program has been around. I mean, I'm going to just say this. I was doing Move into Calm 20 years ago, and I just didn't realize what I was creating at that time. But
Right.
it was more yoga based. And then as
Hmm.
time went on, it's taken on its own life, so to speak. So in September of 2024, I was doing an event that was yoga based for an
Hmm.
organization, and there were 600 parents and children, and I was doing 20-minute increments with yoga with them. You don't do the work for as long as I have and not sensed where some of these kids are. And this little girl, she crawled into my lap. She might have been 9 months old, and her parent was sitting 8 or 10 feet from where I was. And people were, isn't that cute? Well, in my eyes, it's like I'm thinking attachment. And so oftentimes when children have gone through trauma, there is the lack of attachment or like just going up to complete strangers like she did. And it was just so powerful for me. And that's just kind of how I began. And so since then, I've worked with many families, school districts, universities, businesses, nonprofits, Head Start programs. I've done presentations. And right now, currently, as we speak, I am back in school to further my education. And it's called Applied Education in Neuroscience through Butler University. It focuses on trauma, adversity in the nervous system. But the lady who created the program, her name is Dr. Lori Desautels, and she always says it starts with the adults first. So whether
Right.
you're a parent, a teacher, a grandparent, the co-regulation has to start with us, because if we're really high wired, then guess what? The kids are going to be high
Right,
wired.
exactly. That makes so much sense. Thank
Yeah.
you so much for sharing everything. Where can everyone find you? Do you want on social media? You said you have Instagram and Facebook. What are your handles for that?
Okay. Social on Instagram, it's Studio T Pilates, MI for Michigan. On Facebook, I have both a studio page, so it's Studio T Pilates, and then also under Tami Lysher, Facebook. And
Hmm.
then on YouTube, Studio T Pilates 157.
Okay, beautiful. We'll also list that in the show notes too, just so that
Yeah.
everybody
And
can check that out.
and can I add an email in there as well?
Of course, yes, please do.
So if any of the listeners have any kind of questions or, I mean, I'm more than willing to have conversations with people. So you can email me at studio T PIL 595 at gmail.com.
Thank you, Tammy, so much for this information. It's very useful and informative. And I hope that some of the listeners, or all of the listeners, of course, will kind of take a moment and think about their own movement and nervous system regulation and explore the information that you have to offer. It was so great having this episode with you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'm really grateful for this conversation. Tammy, thank you for the work you're doing, for reminding us that healing doesn't have to be forceful and that learning to feel safe in our bodies is a practice, not a destination. If this episode resonated with you, I really encourage you to explore Tami Lysher's work and her Move into Calm program, especially if you've felt stuck in your nervous system or disconnected from your body. And for everyone listening, take a moment after this episode to notice your breath, your body, and what feels a little softer than when you started. Thank you for being here with me. As always, I am thinking of you and sending you love, and I will see you soon.